Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Welcome to the Faculty Forum Online. I'm Glenn Ellison, the Gregory K. Palm Professor of Economics and Department Head for Economics. I'm going to serve as a moderator for today's event. Before we start, let me say that this broadcast is sponsored in part by the MIT Federal Credit Union, MIT Professional Education, and MIT Sloan Executive Education. A reminder that after we hear from Professor Stiglitz, we'll field your questions for him. Please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar to ask them. We'll get to as many as time allows. Now, please welcome Joseph Stiglitz. He's a university professor at Columbia University and author of the recent book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, now available in paperback. Professor Stiglitz earned the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. Previously, he earned his PhD from the MIT Economics Department in 1966, making him one of 12 alumni of our department to hold that distinction. We'll post his full bio in the chat. We've asked Professor Stiglitz to start today's discussion by sharing some of his current research and giving us his insights on COVID-19 and the economy. Professor Stiglitz, welcome.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to share some of my thoughts on the economics of COVID-19. Well, it's mainly or it begins as a disease, a virus, a health issue. It has been transformed into an economic crisis with the highest levels of unemployment since we've seen since the Great Depression, the fastest declines in GDP that we have ever recorded. We obviously don't know how this is going to play out, but it's very clear there's a lot of uncertainties, both about the disease and about how the economic aftermath of the disease. And much of that economic aftermath will depend on the policies that we pursue, and there's a certain degree of controversy over that. So what I want to do this morning is first to lay out what are the economic issues? And this is obviously fundamentally a health issue, but there are a lot of economics involved in COVID-19, and it's given rise to a lot of research actually in economics. And then the two things I want to focus my attention on are the US has been much worse afflicted by the disease. And the question is, why has it been so much worse in the United States? And if you look around the world, you can see different policies with different consequences on health. And then finally, the real thrust of my talk is going to be, there are also large differences in the economic consequences of the pandemic. And again, the United States has been the worst afflicted among the advanced countries. Some have done extraordinarily well, like New Zealand. The United States has done extraordinarily poorly. And that raises important, interesting analytic issues. Why has the United States done so poorly? And then out of that comes the final question, where do we go from here? What would be a reasonable policy response? So I'll share some slides with you. If you want, in the question period, there are a lot of numbers, a lot of charts, but I've decided to really just focus really on the core arguments and talk through what would have been in the charts if I had them. So Let me begin with the economics of pandemics. A key word that economists use all the time are externalities. When the actions of an individual or a country has effects on others that it doesn't take into account. And pandemics are associated with a large amount, very significant externalities. In fact, they're so large and they're so global, we think of them as the control of contagious disease as a global public good. We've recognized the nature of this being a global public good in the creation of global institutions, most importantly, the World Health Organization, WHO. Now, in the presence of externalities, market solutions almost inevitably generate what you call suboptimal outcomes, precisely because individuals and firms don't take account of these effects they have on others. And a few examples are sick individuals may not self-quarantine. They may go to work even when they're sick. They may go to the store when they're sick, and they get a little bit of benefit of doing that, but the cost they impose on others, they don't take that fully into account. Another example of externalities is employers don't take into account the social benefits of providing paid sick leave. Because by providing paid sick leave, their workers are more likely to stay quarantined, and that obviously has benefit for our society, but the employers don't take that into account. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So in general, every country, every advanced country has public health, provisions for public health to recognize the importance of contagious diseases. And we have the Centers for Disease Control is our public response at the national level to concerns about contagious disease. At the same time, national governments don't take into account global externalities. As I said, this is a global externality. And if one country doesn't do what it can to contain it, it will have effects on others. And those externalities are both at the level of health, but also the level of economics. When the United States in 2008, before 2008, didn't oversee its financial market adequately and created the global financial crisis of 2008, that crisis had devastating effects around countries around the world. So that was an example of a global externality from bad economic policy. And so as we start thinking about both our health policies and our economic policies, they have effects on others. And the third core idea is that knowledge is a global public good. Everybody benefits from the creation of knowledge. And just like I said before, whenever there are externalities, public goods, private production will not provide the answer. The same thing is true in the production of knowledge, and particularly when the production of knowledge is concerned about knowledge controlling a pandemic. And obviously, as you think about that, you have to think about the dangers associated with vaccine nationalism. So that's a set of beginning of understanding why public policy is so important in the arena of a pandemic. There are a couple of other things I want to bring out. The first is that you can't buy insurance against some of the key economic and health risks. In fact, it's interesting, many companies thought they had bought some insurance, we call business interruption insurance, and are now being told by their insurance companies, I'm sorry, just when you need it, this is the time when we don't provide that coverage. So inevitably, when you face disasters of all kinds, pandemics, hurricanes, you turn to government for protection. how well the economy is going to perform, how well society is going to depend on how well prepared the government is. There's another important set of market failures. The disease affects some sectors more than others. Those involving more contact are adversely affected. And because resources are imperfectly mobile, they're going to be macroeconomic consequence. The downturn in the afflicted sectors generates what we call macroeconomic externalities to other sectors. And it's not just that the economy remains at full employment with resources going from the afflicted to the non-afflicted sector. There can be high levels of unemployment afflicting the society as a whole. So as I said, this gives you the principles of economics. If you were taking an Ec 101 course, this is where you begin a discussion of the pandemic. Now, as I said, there are markedly different patterns of disease and death. And it is striking the range, even of democratic governments that have managed the disease well, range of countries in developed and less developed countries. South Korea and New Zealand and Germany are among the democratic countries that have done extraordinarily well. US has been among the countries that have done extraordinarily poorly. Brazil is another country that has done very poorly. It is interesting, and it's not just whether you have a lockdown or not that matters. India has had one of the most severe lockdowns, at least in principle, and its disease has been growing exponentially. Of course, there's much we do not know about the disease and effects of the disease and the economics, and this is going to provide fodder for research for years to come. So I want to now move on to talking about why in the area of health has the US performed so well. And this is an economic matter as well as obviously a matter for health scientists. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of health and public policy and health economics. Well, basically, the two areas of problems are we had poor pre-existing conditions and we have poor policies. So in terms of the poor pre-existing conditions, we have poor health in other advanced countries, reflected in shorter life expectancies. And that is, of course, a consequence of the fact that we don't recognize the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right. At least that's one of the important reasons. And one of the consequences of that is that the US has more health inequalities. It's striking that the United States, which is at the frontier, the best medical research, the best hospitals, in many ways, the best medical schools. We have the lowest, among the lowest life expectancies in the advanced countries, and a life expectancy that today is lower than it was in 2015. And we have the greatest level of health inequalities across our society. We also have a poor system of social protection. I mentioned before, paid sick leave. You don't want sick people to go to work. Most countries have almost universal paid sick leave. We have very poor paid sick leave. And of course, that interacts with our economic inequalities. Those at the bottom of the rung are the least likely to have paid sick leave. We have a less resilient healthcare system going into the COVID-19 with less excess capacity, dramatically less capacity. If you look at the hospital beds per capita, just much lower. And then we have some broader societal problems, less social cohesion, less trust. There are a variety of research tools that can identify, quantify that. And we have less respect for science. It was very clear that we needed a public response. As I said before, because of the externalities, it's not just a private matter, it needed a public response. And there was less trust in government and less confidence in government. And part of that, poor preparedness. Hasn't always been that way. We had a White House Office on Pandemics within the National Security Council, NSC. And I think it was perfectly appropriate that it was in the NSC because it represented a pandemic as a real threat to our security, but that was disbanded. We had stockpiles accumulated to masks and protective gear and ventilators, but we didn't maintain them over the years immediately preceding, the 3 years preceding the pandemic. So they were depleted. And then we defunded the Centers for Disease Control, the government agency that's on the front line of responding. So just like the administration every year has proposed cuts in science budgets of 20, 30% or more. And actually, one of the striking areas where there was a real attempt to defund was to shut down the office within the CDC dealing with the transmission of diseases from animals to humans, exactly what COVID-19 was. Couldn't have been, you might say, more targeted to undermining our preparedness. There's also less trust in the private sector than other countries. Our private sector engaged in producing unreliable tests, and people couldn't trust the private sector. And because of the CDC was ill-equipped, it couldn't quickly test the test. And finally, there's less resilience in the private sector. We were incapable of producing even simple products like masks or protective gear, let alone more complicated products like tests and ventilators. Well, we entered this in the beginning of 2020, end of 2019, poor prepared, but then we had a poor public response. We needed to have quick recognition of the risks. The leadership in Washington denied the risks. We needed to explain science. The leadership in Washington is skeptical, attacked science. We needed to explain externalities. The leadership in Washington still doesn't seem to be aware of the full extent of the externalities. We needed to build a sense of social cohesion for enhancing voluntary response to externalities. One of the things that New Zealand did extraordinarily well, and obviously if you have leadership that's talking about divisiveness, you don't do that. We needed a coordinated supply response for producing tests, masks, protective gear. We didn't get that. We needed to provide paid sick leave. Congress recognized the importance of paid sick leave, passed a law, but then under the pressure of our large corporations, we exempted those who worked for corporations with more than 500 employees. 48% of the workers were exempted. There's another manifestation of short-sighted and selfish behavior. And strikingly, in the public arena today, there is still opposition to providing the support needed for the hospitals, for the tests, providing protective gear, helping schools, doing the other things that would be so critical in addressing the health need. That gives us, I hope, some understanding of why the disease has afflicted us so much worse. I now want to turn to the economic and social consequences, which have also differed greatly across countries. Some have had much greater decreases in GDP. The US is among those. Some have had much larger increases in unemployment. Here, the US really does excel. Some are having larger increases in unemployment relative to GDP. Again, the US excels in that, having high levels of unemployment. In some countries, suffering is much worse than others. There are a whole set of, so the question now is, why are things so bad in the United States? Well, you can say at one level, we had a set of policy responses that were enormous. The amount in the first set of packages, close to $3 trillion, close to 15% of GDP. I mean, there's never been a response of that magnitude. But it was not well designed, not well implemented. And, you can spend a lot of money, and if you don't implement it well, it shows that you don't get the results that you would have hoped. There was a lack of prioritization. I would have, very clear, you should have prioritized health first, the most vulnerable first. There's a lack of vision of what kind of an economy we want post-pandemic. We shouldn't want to go back to the kind of economy we had in January 2020, economy marked by high levels of inequality, a lack of resilience, economy that wasn't recognizing the risk of climate change. So there were many things wrong with our economy, and I'm going to argue that one of the things we ought to be doing is, if we're going to be spending so much money, we ought to be thinking more about what kind of an economy we want post-pandemic. There was a lack of understanding what would be required to achieve strong recovery, and what are the factors like the devastation in balance sheets and increases in bankruptcies that would make it more difficult to achieve a strong recovery. One of the reasons that there was that failure in every one of the items I've just listed was that there was a blind faith in a short downturn, followed by a V-shaped recovery. And anybody who had looked at standard epidemiological models was aware that that was a very slow, very unlikely event. If you understand the nature of contagious diseases, there was at least a very high sense of a high likelihood of a long a long presence of the pandemic with significant economic effects. The result of that particular view is that the programs were too short and not comprehensive awareness, not comprehensive enough. And there was a lack of awareness of the underlying economics, evidencing some of the language that talked about a demand, about a stimulus. This was both a demand and a supply side shock, very different from 2008. And there was a sense by some people that the downturn was caused by the lockdown, and it wasn't. The evidence, quite clear by some research now, that it was caused by the fear of the disease that led people not to want to buy certain commodities like go to restaurants. One of the distinctive reasons for the difficulties the United States faced are the large inequalities that I referred to earlier. And that has economic consequences. And one of the stark things that has come out in the data in the last few months or so, the US overall savings rate has reached record levels. The savings rate is 25% in the second quarter. What was going on was very clear, and again, we have data on this. the bottom of our country lives paycheck to paycheck. And when those paychecks were interrupted, they were in a very highly vulnerable position. And so those individuals at the bottom did spend the money as they got it. On the other hand, the people at the top just acted in response to what they saw as the risk going forward, and they put that extra money into their bank accounts. And so, as a savings rate hit 25% in the second quarter. Another problem that was distinctly American was a lack of awareness of the difficulties of administering programs in the United States. You can't just wish money to get out there overnight. And it reflected the limited capacity, for instance, of the UI system, of the unemployment insurance system in the United States. The contrast between some even developing and emerging markets is really striking. When Argentina decided that it needed to get money to children, it made the decision on Tuesday, and on Friday, money was in the hands of the families with the children. It took 4 days. We didn't have that capacity. And then the one program that we had that it was recognized that it was important to keep people on their job, particularly important in the United States because Americans depend on employer-provided health insurance. But our PPP program didn't work, and a lot of discussion about why. One of the reasons was it was administered by the banks, and that turned out to be extraordinarily costly. The funds didn't go to where they were most needed. They went to those who were most connected to the banks, and there was a lack of trust in government forgiveness, and the programs were designed that you took a loan and that if you complied with certain regulations, you would have that loan forgiven, but nobody trusted the government. Overall, the inability, the failure of the government to lay out a long-term program like it had done in 2009 meant that there was a lot more uncertainty. That uncertainty contributed to the high savings rate that I mentioned. So these are some of the reasons why the program in the United States distinctly failed. So what's needed now? Here are a few things. We need a broader ban on evictions and foreclosures. There was a temporary ban, but that's now expired. The financial market continue to collect interest, even though the rest of the economy is in some sense put on hold. And so there's a problem of repossession of cars. There's a need for stay on interest on credit cards and student loans. And there's a real worry that when the crisis is over with the usurious interest rates, far larger fraction of Americans will be in dire financial straits. And this is compounded by the 2005 bankruptcy law. Some other things are needed. There's more help needed for the states and localities, which represent a third of all public expenditures. Deep revenue losses in the 2008 crisis. The tax revenues went down twice the rate of GDP, and already they're facing the shortage of funds, and that will force large-scale cutbacks. And that alone will mean that we will have elevated unemployment rates for years to come. And to me, it's really, since these are on the front line of providing education and health and welfare, this is really foolish, the fight over this. We should have that. We have not provided support for the not-for-profit sector or the knowledge university sector. We want to transform our economy into a knowledge-based economy. And it sounds a little bit self-serving since I come from that sector, but This is, I believe, a really important sector, and you can see the struggle that all of our research institutions are facing, and this is going to have important implications for long-run growth. So what's needed now is a vision of a post-pandemic economy and society. As I said, never has the public provided so much assistance to the private sector. We should use this to help shape the post-pandemic economy, both through who gets funds and the conditions put on the funding. It is interesting that Europe and some other countries are doing a better job on this than the United States. They're trying to structure what kind of economy is going to come back after the pandemic. So let me just conclude with a couple of remarks about where I see this going. We haven't had a V-shaped recovery. The pandemic is going to last much longer than many people thought in the beginning. The result of this is that balance sheets will be eroded, companies will go bankrupt. What began as a COVID-19 shock to the economy is becoming a more conventional economic downturn. When you have large numbers of companies going bankrupt, large erosions of balance sheets of households and firms, you get the key elements of a severe economic downturn. Unless there is strong government intervention, this will last a significant time. So even under the best of circumstances, I think the forecasts are of a recovery, not next year, but in the year after. That will be optimistic unless we actually take much stronger public actions than we are currently doing in the aftermath of the CARES Act, which was passed this spring, but we haven't had the further assistance that our economy needs right now. So with that, let me open it up for questions. Oops.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. So let me just a reminder to our alumni viewers that to ask questions to the guests today, please put your questions in the Q&A. You can also look through the Q&A and upvote questions. You know, I have the difficult job of moderating a discussion with thousands of audience members. There are already 91 questions in the Q&A, but if you can vote up and down the ones you like, I'll try to address those to Professor Stiglitz. So let me start with one question I picked out of the Q&A, which was, in your discussion of what went wrong, you didn't really focus much on politicization of the COVID pandemic and of the mask wars. And do you have a sense of, do you think that you know, the politicization of the pandemic was a big factor or not? And if so, what do you think we can do about it?
Yes, I did. I was trying to be non-political in my remarks. I did say very much that there was a lack of focus on science and on an attempt to explain the basic nature of epidemiology. I think you could explain it. You know, the equations, basic equations, obviously are not going to be understandable to people who don't have a certain background in mathematics, but the intuitions are pretty clear. And a lot of people who are not mathematics were talking about the R factor and R naught. So I think you could have done a much better job of explaining the science, and other countries did that. And that, I used the word social cohesion, part of social cohesion. We're talking about politicalization, divides about what were the main determinants of the spread of the disease. You know, there's going to be some disagreement, even among scientists, but one could talk about the core agreement among most scientists. I think there were a couple of other elements. We wanted to blame, the administration wanted to blame China. And some of the rhetoric was very ugly in this respect. Obviously, looking at China's control, it was clearly not ideal, nor was the WHO. But as things became clearer and clearer, they did start to act. And, you could say there was a delay because of their failed system of several weeks. But we've known about the disease since the beginning of January, certainly by February, and we're now in August. And so if we say they didn't act quickly, what do we say about ourselves where we're talking about months and months of inadequate action? And that's politics. That was a politicalization of the whole thing. And the notion of shutdowns as interfering with your freedom, giving other people a disease is imposing costs on others. That's why I use the vocabulary externalities. And when there are externalities, everybody should recognize your freedom is my unfreedom. You're taking away my freedom to be free of the disease. And societies with a high level of social cohesion, like New Zealand, they understood this. And so when you had a good government, you could explain very clearly to the citizens what is entailed by your going out there and not taking actions that prevent the spread of the disease.
Okay, and I guess, big question that you brought up there is the respect for science. And I think you've written previously that respect for science in the United States is a big issue. Do you have a sense of what we could do concretely to get more respect for science in the United States?
That's a really hard question. My book that we talked about, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, I began, in the beginning of that book, I talk about why is it our standard of living is so much higher than it was 250 years ago. If you look at the chart of standards of living, they were no change for hundreds and hundreds of years until around 1800. And what I say is, it was the Enlightenment, the scientific method, it was science, our understanding of nature. That was one of the pivotal things that have led us to having a higher standard of living than we had 250 years ago, to longer life expectancy. So one of the reasons I wrote the book, it was before COVID-19, but is to try to make us understand that at the root of our economic well-being is science and technology. Hopefully, respect for science.
And can I ask, are there things you would have done differently in the book if you were writing it today after COVID-19?
Well, I would have used a lot of COVID-19 examples and how science enabled us, for instance, to respond so quickly to identify what the disease was, and how much more sophisticated our response has been than it was in previous pandemics in history. The other thing that I emphasized in the book are the important roles of government. That that a modern complex society requires an important role for government, partly to make investments like in basic science that I call for in the book, and this gives a very good example. Also for disaster preparedness, COVID-19 is a wonderful example of why that's important. So is climate change and other risks that our society faces. Science has made us aware of that. It's a wonderful example of the discovery of climate change and the role of greenhouse gases is a real scientific triumph. Those important roles. And then the other set of roles of the role of government in regulation, preventing externalities, preventing individuals from imposing harms on others. And finally, what I emphasize in my book is that markets on their own don't achieve an acceptable distribution of income. And our markets have produced a very unequal distribution of income. Well, again, COVID-19, the virus, which is not an equal opportunity virus, has exposed and will exacerbate inequalities in our society, highlighting again our failures and the important role of government. So I think COVID-19 is, if I were to do it again, would be sort of examples I would use in almost every chapter of the book.
And so I'm getting a lot of questions bubbling up in the Q&A about, your views of capitalism. Is capitalism still viable? What are your thoughts about universal basic income? What are your views about sort of policies to, to help address the income inequality that you mentioned? Do you think universal basic income is a good idea, or do you have other thoughts?
No, I think that, temporarily we are having a form of universal basic income. We're the $1,200 checks that we send out for everybody below a certain level of income, we're a very simple form of that. But over the long term, I'm much more aligned with what the commitment we made right after World War II, where we said, it's responsibility of the government to make sure that there are jobs for everybody willing and able to work. So it's that commitment to making sure that we provide strong employment opportunities for everybody. And let me tell you why I believe that. Two basic reasons. First, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. We have a deficient infrastructure. We need an enormous amount of care for our elderly, education, for our sick. We need to make a green transition. And that investment in green transition is going to take a lot of resources. So, some people say, we can't afford it. As an economist, I say, well, the issue is, do we have the resources? And so I believe we do have the resources, but we shouldn't just be, this means that we can give jobs for everybody. And the view that we have, that Ben Bernanke talked about, that we have savings glut, or that AI is going to result in unemployment, really means for the next 30 years at least, we have our work ahead of us. And that means we can provide jobs for everybody who wants. The second thing is, we're still in a world where most of us believe there's dignity in work. Some of my younger students tell me that this is very 20th century, and that they can live a very happy life, a spiritual life without work. So, and I recognize that may be a possibility, but at least for people of my generation, work is an important part of life.
Can I ask that, and I'm getting requests for your economic advice to the administration. So can you think about, if you think about these longer run priorities like improving education and work and job creation, how do you see that fitting in with what the administration is going to be doing, the next administration will be doing in the short run, dealing with the hopefully end of the COVID epidemic? Do you have views on, does it depend on, whether we have a vaccine in place or not a vaccine in place by the end of the year? Is that something we deal with COVID first and then move on to our other priorities, or do we pursue them simultaneously?
Well, I think we have to pursue them simultaneously, but you might say nuanced. Obviously, the longer the pandemic, the more we're going to have, you might call it support systems to keep the economy just going. And the faster we get the pandemic under the control, the faster we'll begin what I would call the rebuild phase of our policies. So we need support and rebuild. And we want to phase those together. So let me give you an example. In the support, I mentioned at the end of my remarks, I think we should be moving to a knowledge economy. And one part of our society, that's economy that's not getting any support are our knowledge institutions, our research universities, our universities more generally. And they're facing, and our education system even more broadly, they're facing real challenges during the course of the pandemic. And their sources of revenues are going down dramatically. So to me, an important part of the support should be prioritizing, like I said, and prioritizing things that we really don't want to get destroyed. And we want to maintain the strength of our educational system and our research institutions, you know, that to make us prepared for the world post-pandemic. So I see that as part of the support, thinking very carefully. I put a higher priority than that, than supporting cruise ships or even supporting airlines. It seems to me that if you want to say what is going to make most difference, you know, when the airlines go bankrupt, the airplanes are still there. They'll be downsized. There'll be a Chapter 11. Those institutions will still continue, but our universities and the damage in our not having an educated populace, that'll be long-term in my mind.
Okay, and I have any questions about the sort of long-run effects on the US economy? You know, we know in the Great Recession, we had a big financial crisis and it had quite long-lasting impacts working through the state governments and through many other channels. Do you get a sense of what we should expect going forward as the damage from the COVID pandemic? Is this a V-shaped recovery, or is this something that's going to go on for, you know, we're going to be dealing with for years?
Well, we know it's not going to be V-shaped. We know that the longer it lasts, the stronger the erosion of the balance sheets that I talked about, the more damage from bankruptcies, the more damage from universities, colleges being closed down, people not getting the education that they would have gotten if we had helped provide more support to our educational system. So in my mind, you know, to use a word that some of you in physics know and some of the economists know, hysteresis. There are long-term effects. The recovery, if we were to continue on the current course, I would see as being every bit as difficult as the 2008-9 economic downturn. What I'm hoping, though, is we made a critical mistake in 2008-9. I was critical at the time. I said, this is likely going to take a lot more resources to get a robust recovery. Don't believe that there are all these green shoots. Have a bigger stimulus package. And there was division in the Obama administration. I thought there should have been more money over a longer period of time. And after the first set of supports, it was impossible to get the next set of support that should have been there because some people said they're worried about the deficit. It was a little bit hypocritical because some of the same people said that they were worried about the deficit in 2018 voted for a tax bill that led to massive deficits, so that we, even before the pandemic, we had a $1 trillion deficit in 1 year. So it was a little bit hypocritical, a different agenda. It was political. That's the same issue today. If we have a strong support and recovery, build back the economy program in 2021-22, I think we can get back to a semblance of normality relatively quickly.
Okay, and question that
22, 23, 24. But if we don't, we're talking about something that's going to be much longer. Just to give you one fact, you know, our employment in state and local government, which is really important for our health and education and welfare, did not get back to the pre-crisis level, even by 2019. So that was a decade-long effect.
So, you know, we've got questions about the stock market, and, you know, I guess people asking you, you know, do you see a disconnect between what's going on in the stock market and what's going on in the real economy with, you know, tremendous levels of unemployment and disruption? You know, do you think this is the stock market is very confident that we will get these things ironed out and implement the correct policies and get the economy back going soon? Or do you see it as a result of inequality where this pandemic has been good for some of the biggest tech companies? How do you sort of see that, what some people perceive as this disconnect?
Yeah, it is a total disconnect. And it's a disconnect that we often see, partly because of the inequalities that you in our society that I mentioned. Partly the stock market as a whole disproportionately, it's the tech giants who are doing very well. Much of the rest of the economy is not doing so well. So even the stock market, if you look at the distribution of firms, is reflecting huge inequalities. Some firms, few firms doing very well, many firms going bankrupt, doing very poorly. That doesn't bode well for the long-term well-being of the economy. But there are a couple of other things. When inequality is very great, wages go down, profits go up, the stock market does well. So stock market is sometimes a strong stock market is a sign of a sick economy. When the economy is very weak, the interest rates get very low, and people put their money in the stock market because bonds are yielding nothing. That's a sign of a weak economy, even though the stock market is doing very well. And I mentioned before that the savings rate in the United States had reached probably an all-time high, 25%. Well, a lot of the liquidity that the Fed has been putting in, and that the pandemic packages have put in, are going into savings, and that liquidity is looking someplace to park, and it's going into the stock market. So that has given us even greater disconnect than is often the case. So it shouldn't be viewed as a sign at all of a healthy economy. Finally, let me say, stock markets are almost always short-sighted. And so I don't think there is any sense, awareness of the risks to our health or the health of our economy that has been adequately incorporated into the stock market. And so I don't read much into what you see in the stock market in terms of the health of the real economy. It is very good for a few people who are doing very well, but not for most of our citizens.
Okay, thank you. I think I have time for just one final question. I'm going to try to see if I can end this on a hopeful note. You know, in your both People, Power, and Profits, you talk about your idea of globalization with a club and what is the way forward. I think there's often this idea that when you have a crisis, crises can be opportunities. Are there some ways that you can see where we can sort of take advantage of the COVID pandemic to really make a sort of important long run move in restructuring our economy or restructuring our political policies toward the economy that you think is, could be an opportunity that could help us in the long run?
Oh, I think it can be, because in some ways we have learned a lot about some of our problems. We have learned a lot about the importance of social cohesion, trust, the role of science. We talked about that before. We've learned about the weaknesses associated with inequality, lack of resilience. We've understood what happens when you don't have adequate preparation for risk. And there's going to be a continuing risk of another pandemic, and we have the risk of climate change. So I think if we take on board the lessons that the pandemic has provided, we will emerge with a stronger economy. And that same thing goes for globalization. The pandemic has brought home the sense in which we are highly interdependent. Those viruses don't respect boundaries. They don't carry passports. They don't carry visas. Just like CO2 molecules, greenhouse gas molecules, don't carry visas, don't respect boundaries. So we have some existential planetary issues that we have to deal with together, even with countries that we may fundamentally disagree with. But on this, you're all in the same lifeboat together, and there may be other people in that lifeboat who you don't like, but you don't sink the lifeboat. You say, whatever our disagreements, we have to work together to make sure that we manage these risks. And so the risk of future pandemics, the risk of climate change, are risks that we have to all work together. And so in that sense, I think it may provide a strengthening of the positive multilateralism that will help make us able to meet some of these challenges going forward.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just say final thank you to Professor Stiglitz for joining us today. That was really just a fantastic discussion. On behalf of the Alumni Association, I want to thank all of the viewers for tuning into this MIT Faculty Forum. We're going to forward all the questions that were asked via the Q&A to our speaker today. A tremendous number of questions, so I can't imagine you can address them all, but we will forward those on. Our staff is going to keep the chat window open for networking purposes for another 15 minutes. So if those of you who want to ask questions to each other through the chat feature, that will be there. This broadcast is going to be available on the MIT Alumni Association YouTube channel within a week of today's airing. Again, thank you again one final time, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you. It was just fantastic to talk to you. And thank you to all of our MIT alumni for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.